The alarm on the station reached my ears before I even understood what it meant. I was standing on the observation deck of Kestrel Station, watching 3 unmarked ships drop out of warp far too close to the human transport docked beside us. My name is Vesa Elun, and at that moment, I was only a junior observer for the Galactic Council. I had no idea I was about to witness the moment everything changed. The unmarked ships belonged to the Korath Alliance, a species known across the galaxy for taking what they wanted and daring anyone to stop them. They had done this before, to smaller species, to quiet mining colonies, to anyone who could not fight back. But this time, they had picked a human transport. I remember turning to my colleague, an older Ithari diplomat named Doran Vask, and asking him if we should call for council intervention. He shook his head slowly and told me to watch instead. He said something I never forgot. He said, "Humans do not wait to be rescued." The Korath ships opened a channel, broadcasting to the human vessel in a tone that dripped with confidence. Their commander, a broad-shouldered being named Threxil, ordered the humans to power down their engines and prepare to be boarded. He said their cargo now belonged to the Alliance, and any resistance would be treated as an act of war. There was a long pause, then a voice answered, calm and steady, almost polite. It belonged to a woman named Grace Bennett, the captain of the transport. She said she understood the threat and that she wanted to give Threxil one chance to reconsider before things became difficult for him. I laughed. I actually laughed, because it sounded absurd. One transport ship, lightly armed, facing 3 warships, and the human captain was the one offering mercy. Doran did not laugh. He watched the screen with an expression I had never seen on him before. It looked like worry, but not for the humans. Threxil laughed too, over the open channel, and told her that humans were known throughout the galaxy for their empty words and their fear of real conflict. He said he would enjoy taking her ship apart piece by piece to teach her species a lesson about respecting their betters. Grace Bennett's response was short. She said, "We tried." What happened next took less than 4 minutes. I watched the sensor readouts spike as the human transport's shields reconfigured in ways our engineers had never seen. Small defense drones, no larger than a human hand, launched from hidden ports along the hull. They did not attack the Korath ships directly. Instead, they disabled their long-range sensors and communication arrays with quiet, precise strikes. Then the transport's engines flared, and the ship moved in a pattern that should not have been possible for a vessel its size. It slipped between the 3 warships, using their own bulk to block each other's firing angles. The Korath commanders scrambled to adjust, but by the time they understood what was happening, their weapons systems had already been jammed by a signal none of our scientists could identify. Threxil's ship tried to retreat. The human transport did not chase it. Instead, Grace Bennett's voice came over the channel one more time, calm as before, informing Threxil that his engines would remain locked for the next 6 hours, giving the local council authorities plenty of time to arrive and discuss the attempted act of piracy. I stood there in stunned silence. Doran finally spoke, and his voice was quiet. He said this was not a victory. It was a warning that most species in this galaxy were too foolish to notice. I did not understand him then. I was young, and like most young observers, I believed that humans were simply lucky. Their technology was advanced in strange, unpredictable ways, but their numbers were small, their empire young, their military presence thin across the stars. Every other species who had earned a seat on the Galactic Council had done so through centuries of conquest or diplomacy. Humans had arrived less than 1 human lifetime ago, and yet here they were, embarrassing one of the most feared raiding fleets in known space, without firing a single lethal shot. Later that day, I filed my official report, describing the incident as a minor skirmish resolved through superior technology. Doran read my report before I submitted it, and asked me to add 1 line. He told me to write that the human captain had given the Korath commander a chance to walk away. I asked him why that detail mattered. He said, "Because it always happens first, and no one ever believes it means anything, until it is too late." 3 days later, I was assigned to the Council's diplomatic mission to the human homeworld sector, a routine rotation meant to observe how humans conducted business with neighboring species. I expected to find arrogance, perhaps a growing confidence after their humiliation of the Korath fleet. Instead, I found something far more unsettling. I found humility. Human ports were crowded with ships from a dozen different species, all trading freely, all treated with the same courtesy regardless of size or strength. I watched Grace Bennett herself, the same captain who had disabled 3 warships without casualties, personally help load cargo for a group of small, timid traders from a distant system who had been cheated by a Korath merchant weeks earlier. She refunded them from her own resources and never once mentioned the incident at Kestrel Station. I asked her about it directly, since I had clearance to speak with her for my report. I asked why she had been so gentle with people who had nothing to offer her in return. She looked at me for a moment, and then she said something that stayed with me for the rest of my life. She said, "We protect people because it is right, not because they can pay us back." But she also said, "If someone hurts the people we protect, we remember, and we do not forget quickly." At the time, I filed that quote away as an interesting cultural note. I did not yet understand it as a warning. Over the following weeks, I studied human history through their public records, curious about a species that could be both dangerously skilled in conflict and remarkably kind in daily life. I found long records of division and disagreement among their own people, wars fought over land, over beliefs, over resources. I found records of incredible cruelty in their past, but also long periods where they worked tirelessly to help each other, to build cities, to cure diseases, to reach beyond their own world into the stars. What struck me most was how quickly humans adapted. Every challenge they faced seemed to teach them something new, and they carried those lessons forward instead of repeating old mistakes forever, the way some species did. Their history was full of conflict, yes, but it was also full of recovery, of rebuilding, of forming alliances even with those who had once opposed them. I remember writing in my personal notes that humans seemed to treat kindness and strength as the same trait, rather than opposites. Most species I had studied believed you had to choose one or the other. Humans appeared to believe that true strength meant having the ability to cause great harm, and choosing not to, until choosing otherwise became necessary. Doran found me one evening reviewing these notes in the observation lounge of our diplomatic vessel. He sat across from me and asked what I had learned. I told him I believed humans were simply misunderstood, that their reputation for being fragile and inexperienced did not match what I had seen. He nodded slowly and told me that most species in the galaxy still believed the old assumptions, because humans had never given them a reason to think otherwise. Not yet. I asked him what he meant by not yet. He looked out at the stars for a long moment before answering. He said the Korath Alliance would not accept their embarrassment quietly. Species like them never did. He said somewhere out there, in Korath space, commanders were already planning how to save face, how to prove that the incident at Kestrel Station had been a fluke, a lucky break for one human ship. He was right. 3 weeks later, reports began arriving from the outer colonies, human settlements far from the protection of the Central Fleet. Small raids at first, cargo stolen, communication relays destroyed, isolated incidents that seemed unconnected. But I had learned enough by then to recognize a pattern forming, the same way a storm gathers quietly before it breaks. I brought my concerns to the Council Oversight Committee, urging them to increase monitoring of the border regions near human territory. Most members dismissed my worry, insisting that humans were more than capable of handling minor pirates and border disputes on their own. One senior delegate from a heavily armored species laughed at my report, saying that humans were known for diplomacy and trade, not military strength, and that any real conflict would expose how limited their defenses truly were. I did not share his confidence. I had watched Grace Bennett disable 3 warships in under 4 minutes without firing a single lethal shot, and I had heard her say that humans remembered when someone hurt the people they protected. I began to suspect that whatever the Korath Alliance was planning, they had badly misjudged who they were about to provoke. Doran requested a transfer for both of us to the border monitoring station nearest the disturbances, a quiet outpost called Farron's Reach, shared jointly by human and council forces. He told me privately that he wanted to witness whatever happened next firsthand, rather than reading about it secondhand in a report written by someone who did not understand what they were seeing. We arrived at Farron's Reach 4 days later. The station commander, a human named Daniel Whitfield, greeted us warmly and gave us a tour of the facility. He seemed calm, almost cheerful, despite the recent raids nearby. I asked him if he was worried about the increasing hostility from Korath forces. He smiled and told me that worry rarely solved problems, preparation did. That night, as Doran and I reviewed sensor logs from the past month, we noticed something strange. The pattern of Korath raids was not random. Each strike hit slightly closer to Farron's Reach, testing the response time of the joint human and Council defense forces, probing for weaknesses. Someone in the Korath Alliance was planning something larger, and Farron's Reach appeared to be the target. I remember feeling a chill as I realized what this meant. The Korath were not simply lashing out from wounded pride. They were building toward a real strike, one meant to prove, once and for all, that humans were as weak as they had always assumed. I looked at Doran, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely concerned. He said only one thing before we ended our review for the night. He said, "They still believe the old story about humans. They are about to learn the true one." I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about Grace Bennett's calm voice over the comm channel, offering Threxel a chance to walk away, and his laughter in response. I kept thinking about how she had said humans remembered when people hurt those they protected. I wondered how long the Korath Alliance would continue to underestimate a species capable of both such patience and such quiet, devastating precision. I did not know it then, but the events about to unfold at Farron's Reach would become the turning point the entire galaxy would speak of for generations. A lesson that every new species joining the Galactic Council would eventually learn, one way or another. Some would learn it through careful study of history, as I eventually did. Others would learn it the hard way, exactly as the Korath Alliance was about to. Standing on that quiet station, watching the stars outside the viewport, I had no idea that within days I would witness firsthand why every experienced diplomat in the galaxy repeated the same careful warning to newcomers. Never mistake human patience for weakness, and never, under any circumstances, cross the line they draw so quietly that most species never even notice it exists until it is far too late to take back what they have done. The attack on Farron's Reach began 7 days after Doran and I arrived, and it began with a trick so simple that I still find it hard to believe it worked on anyone. A single unmarked cargo ship approached the station requesting emergency docking, claiming engine failure and a medical emergency on board. Station protocol required immediate assistance for any vessel reporting injured passengers, human or otherwise, and Commander Whitfield authorized the docking without hesitation. I was in the command center when the cargo ship's true nature revealed itself. The moment its docking clamps locked into place, its hull split open along hidden seams, and armed Korath soldiers poured through the connecting corridor before station security could seal the airlocks. Alarms blared through every corridor. I froze, uncertain what to do, while Doran pulled me toward the reinforced observation room where senior staff gathered during emergencies. Commander Whitfield's voice came over the station intercom, steady despite the chaos unfolding around us. He ordered all non-essential personnel to secure locations and instructed his defense teams to contain the intrusion rather than engage directly, prioritizing the safety of station residents over immediate confrontation. I remember thinking how strange it was that even under attack, his first concern was minimizing harm rather than retaliating. The Korath soldiers moved through the lower decks quickly, taking hostages from among the station's maintenance staff and civilian traders, mostly members of smaller, weaker species who had no way to defend themselves. I watched through security feeds as they herded a group of frightened Ithari merchants into a cargo bay, using them as leverage to demand control of the station's command systems. Their leader, a Korath officer named Vantrek, broadcast his demands to Commander Whitfield directly. He wanted access codes to the station's defense grid, full control of the docking bay, and safe passage for his forces once their objective was complete. He warned that any attempt to resist would result in immediate harm to the hostages. I expected Whitfield to negotiate carefully, to stall for time while reinforcements arrived. Instead, his response was almost disappointingly calm. He agreed to Van Trek's demands, requesting only a short delay to verify that the hostages remained unharmed before transferring any codes. Van Trek, confident in his position, agreed to the delay. Doran leaned close to me and whispered that something did not add up. Humans, he said, rarely handed over control so easily, especially not to someone threatening civilians. I asked him what he thought Whitfield was actually doing. He admitted he did not know, but he suspected the delay was not for verification at all. He was right. During those 15 minutes, station security teams quietly redirected the ventilation systems throughout the cargo bay where the hostages were held, filling the area with a mild sedative gas designed for medical emergencies rather than combat. The gas affected only beings without the specific respiratory adaptations that humans and a few other species shared, meaning it left the human security personnel completely unaffected while subduing the Korath soldiers within minutes. By the time Van Trek realized what was happening, his forces were already collapsing around him, and station security moved in to secure the hostages without a single serious injury on either side. Van Trek himself was captured, attempting to flee back toward his damaged cargo ship, only to find its systems had been remotely disabled the moment his forces boarded. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and confusion. The entire crisis had been resolved without violence, without lasting harm to anyone, human or otherwise. I turned to Doran, expecting him to share my relief, but his expression remained troubled. I asked him why he still looked concerned when the danger had clearly passed. He told me to watch Commander Whitfield's face on the security feed as Van Trek was brought before him in restraints. I did, and I saw something I had not expected. Whitfield's calm expression had shifted into something colder, something far more serious than the composed professionalism he had shown throughout the crisis. Whitfield asked Van Trek directly who had ordered the attack, and whether the Korath Alliance leadership had authorized the taking of civilian hostages as a deliberate strategy. Van Trek, still confident despite his capture, admitted proudly that the Korath High Command had specifically chosen civilian hostages because they believed humans would never risk harming innocents to resist, making the strategy foolproof against any species with genuine compassion for others. I watched Whitfield's jaw tighten at that answer. He said nothing further to Van Trek, instead ordering his transfer to council custody for formal proceedings. But before turning away, he said one thing that I have never forgotten. He said that the Korath Alliance had just confirmed something the human fleet needed to know for certain, that their leadership viewed compassion as a weakness to exploit, rather than a strength to respect. Doran explained to me afterward why that admission mattered so much. He said humans could forgive almost any mistake, any misunderstanding, any act of aggression born from fear or desperation. But deliberately using kindness as a weapon against those who showed it, deliberately targeting the vulnerable because you believed their protectors would never fight back to save them, that was different. That was the line Grace Bennett had spoken about weeks earlier, the one humans remembered crossing. Within hours of Van Trek's capture, the Human Fleet Command issued a formal statement to the Galactic Council, requesting a tribunal to address what they called a deliberate violation of protected civilian status during armed conflict. The tone of the statement was measured, professional, entirely within the bounds of council law. Nothing in it suggested anger or desire for revenge, only a request for justice through proper channels. Many species on the council, myself included at the time, viewed this as further proof that humans preferred diplomacy over confrontation, even after a direct attack on their own territory. The Korath Alliance leadership publicly dismissed the tribunal request, claiming their forces had acted independently without official authorization, distancing themselves from Van Trek's actions while quietly continuing to support raids along the border. I traveled with Doran to the council session, where the tribunal request was formally debated. The chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, many arguing that the matter was a minor border dispute unworthy of full council attention. I watched Grace Bennett, present as a witness to the Farron's Reach incident, sit quietly through hours of dismissive commentary from delegates who clearly believed her presence there was simply procedural formality. When finally given the chance to speak, she did not raise her voice or argue passionately for immediate action. She simply presented the recorded confession from Vantrek, the clear admission that civilians had been deliberately targeted because Korath leadership believed human compassion made them exploitable. She asked the council only one question after playing the recording. She asked whether any species present believed that targeting the vulnerable to exploit the protective instincts of others should be treated as an acceptable strategy of war. The chamber fell silent. Even delegates who had dismissed the matter earlier seemed uncomfortable with the question posed so directly. The council ultimately voted to formally condemn the Korath Alliance's actions and issued a warning demanding immediate cessation of hostilities along the human border, alongside financial reparations for the affected station and its residents. I remember thinking, at the time, that this resolution felt like a fair and reasonable outcome, exactly the kind of measured justice one would expect from a functioning galactic community. Doran did not share my optimism. As we left the chamber, he told me that formal condemnations and reparations meant little to species like the Korath Alliance, who measured strength only through direct confrontation and viewed diplomatic consequences as toothless gestures from those unwilling to truly fight. He was right again. Within 2 weeks, Korath forces launched a second, far larger assault, this time not against a border station, but against an actual human colony world called New Harmony, home to nearly 2 million civilians who had built their community from nothing over 3 generations. Unlike the probing test at Farron's Reach, this attack came without warning, without demands, without any pretense of negotiation. I learned of the attack while reviewing routine council correspondence in my quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel. The report was brief and devastating. Korath warships had bombarded the colony's orbital defense platforms before deploying ground forces to seize control of the planet's resource processing facilities that provided rare minerals essential to advanced technology throughout the region. Civilian casualties were reported immediately, families caught in the initial bombardment before evacuation procedures could be completed, medical facilities overwhelmed by the sudden scale of the assault. I remember reading those first reports with a growing sense of horror, understanding immediately that this was not a raid or a probe, but a calculated act meant to demonstrate Korath dominance over a species they still believed to be fundamentally weak. Doran found me still reading the reports hours later, unable to look away from the growing casualty numbers. He sat beside me quietly for a long moment before speaking. He told me that whatever restraint humanity had shown until this point had likely reached its absolute limit, and that the galaxy was about to learn something about humans that most species had never truly understood. I asked him what that was. He said that humans had spent centuries of their own history learning a difficult lesson, that patience shown to those unwilling to change their behavior eventually had to end, or it would only invite greater harm to those who could not defend themselves. He said humans called this the point of no return, and he believed the Korath Alliance had just crossed it in the worst possible way. That night, official communication from Human Fleet Command reached the Council, informing all member species that a formal state of active defense had been declared regarding New Harmony and all affected human territories. The message contained no threats, no dramatic declarations, only a simple statement that immediate action would be taken to secure the safety of all human citizens and allied species within the affected region, using whatever resources were necessary to accomplish that goal. I did not understand the full weight of that message until days later, when I finally learned what Human Fleet Command had actually been preparing during the months of patient diplomacy and measured responses that had characterized their behavior since the very first incident at Kestrel Station. What I discovered changed everything I thought I understood about the species the galaxy had so badly underestimated. Doran arranged for both of us to accompany a council observation team traveling to the human fleet staging area near the border, officially to monitor the promised defensive action for compliance with council law. Privately, he told me he wanted to understand exactly what humans had been building while the rest of the galaxy assumed they were simply weak and hesitant. What we found when we arrived defied everything I had expected. The staging area contained not one grand fleet gathered in a show of force, but dozens of smaller task groups, each organized around different specialties, spread across a wide region of space in a pattern that seemed almost random until a young human logistics officer named Oliver Pratt explained it to us during our tour. He told us that human military doctrine had shifted decades earlier away from concentrating power into a few massive fleets, toward smaller, highly adaptable groups capable of operating independently across vast distances. He said this approach had been developed specifically because human commanders understood they could never match the raw size of older, more established species empires, so they focused instead on flexibility, speed, and precision. I asked him how such a scattered approach could possibly respond effectively to a coordinated large-scale attack like the one on New Harmony. He smiled and told me that scattered did not mean disconnected. Every task group remained linked through a communication network humans had spent years perfecting, one that Council engineers had studied but never fully understood, allowing instant coordination across distances that would leave most other species' fleets isolated and vulnerable. Doran asked him directly how long humans had known this conflict with the Korath Alliance was likely to escalate this far. Oliver Pratt's expression grew more serious. He told us that human intelligence analysts had identified the pattern of Korath aggression years before the Kestrel Station incident, tracking their expansion and their history of testing weaker neighbors before committing to larger-scale conquest. He explained that Human Fleet Command had made a deliberate decision early on to avoid provoking open conflict while quietly preparing defenses and gathering intelligence, hoping that diplomatic pressure through the Council might resolve tensions without loss of life on either side. He said this approach had bought valuable time, allowing human industry to develop and produce technology specifically designed to counter Korath tactics, technology that had never been tested in real combat until the moment it was needed. I asked him why humans had not simply shared this information with the Council earlier, allowing other species to prepare or assist in deterring Korath aggression before it escalated to open warfare. His answer surprised me. He said human leadership had learned through their own difficult history that premature warnings often led to panic, and panic led to mistakes that cost lives unnecessarily. He said humans preferred to prepare quietly and act decisively when action truly became necessary, rather than raising alarms that might not lead anywhere productive. Doran and I spent the following days reviewing historical records with the assistance of human military historians who had been assigned to answer Council questions about the unfolding conflict. What I learned during those days reshaped my entire understanding of the species I had been observing for months. Human history, I discovered, was defined by an unusual pattern rarely seen among other Council species: long periods of internal conflict and disagreement, sometimes lasting generations, followed by periods of remarkable unity and cooperation whenever a shared threat or challenge demanded it. Their history contained countless examples of former rivals setting aside deep disagreements to work together against a common danger, only to return to peaceful disagreement once that danger had passed. A human historian named Margaret Whitmore explained this pattern to me during one of our conversations. She said humans possessed an unusual ability to hold on to both compassion and resolve simultaneously, treating them not as opposing forces but as complementary tools suited to different situations. She said this dual nature confused many species who expected consistency of behavior, when in reality, humans simply matched their response to the nature of the challenge before them. She showed me records of ancient human conflicts, long resolved by the time humanity reached the stars, where opposing groups had eventually found ways to cooperate despite generations of hostility. She explained that this capacity for eventual reconciliation, even after terrible conflict, was balanced by an equally strong capacity for decisive action when reconciliation proved impossible, particularly when the safety of the vulnerable was at stake. I asked her directly what she believed would happen now that the Korath Alliance had crossed the line by attacking New Harmony directly. She paused for a long moment before answering. She said that human military doctrine included a concept called proportional escalation, meaning that responses to aggression increased in scale to match not just the immediate attack, but the demonstrated intent behind it. She explained that a single skirmish, even a violent one, might be treated as an isolated incident requiring measured response, but a deliberate, planned assault against civilian populations, following repeated warnings and diplomatic engagement, demonstrated a clear intent to continue such attacks unless decisively stopped. She said Human Fleet Command would now treat the Korath Alliance not as a rival to be negotiated with, but as an active threat to be neutralized as completely and efficiently as possible. I asked her what neutralized meant in practical terms. She chose her words carefully, telling me that human forces would move to eliminate the Korath Alliance's capacity to continue launching attacks, targeting their military infrastructure, their fleet capabilities, and their ability to threaten human territory or allied species going forward. She emphasized that this did not mean the destruction of Korath civilization or their people as a whole, but rather the dismantling of the specific military and political structures responsible for authorizing attacks on civilians. Doran asked her how humans could be so certain of achieving such a specific and controlled outcome against an entrenched, aggressive empire that had operated successfully for generations before ever encountering humanity. Margaret Whitmore's answer was simple. She said human forces had spent months quietly studying Korath military doctrine, their command structures, their supply lines, and their strategic weaknesses, using diplomatic engagement partly as cover to gather this information without alerting Korath leadership to how closely they were being studied. She told us that human intelligence had identified several critical vulnerabilities in Korath military organization, particularly their heavy reliance on centralized command decisions and their history of underestimating opponents they considered inferior. She said human strategy was built specifically around exploiting these weaknesses rather than matching Korath forces in a direct confrontation of equal strength. I found myself both fascinated and unsettled by this explanation. The picture emerging was of a species that had appeared weak and hesitant by choice, carefully cultivating an image of caution and restraint while quietly preparing a response calculated with remarkable precision. I asked Margaret Whitmore whether this level of calculated preparation troubled her personally, given the ultimately lethal nature of the coming conflict. She admitted that it did, saying that no thoughtful person found comfort in the necessity of armed conflict, regardless of how justified or carefully planned. But she said humans had learned, sometimes through painful historical experience, that failing to respond decisively to those who deliberately targeted the vulnerable only invited more suffering in the future, both for the immediate victims and for others who might be targeted next if aggression went unanswered. Doran spent hours reviewing the technical specifications of human fleet capabilities that had been shared with Council observers as part of the transparency requirements for military action within Council territory. He explained to me afterward that human ship designs prioritized adaptability and rapid technological iteration over raw firepower, meaning their vessels could be updated and improved far more quickly than the more rigid, tradition-bound designs favored by older species empires like the Korath Alliance. He showed me records demonstrating how human engineers had developed countermeasures specifically targeting weapons systems used by Korath warships, systems that had been studied extensively during the months of tension following the Kestrel Station incident. These countermeasures had never been deployed in actual combat, remaining a carefully guarded secret until the moment they would be needed most. I asked Doran directly whether he believed humans had deliberately allowed the situation to escalate to this point, understanding all along that armed conflict was likely inevitable, simply to justify decisive military action with full council support and moral justification. He considered the question seriously before answering, which I appreciated, since I knew he took such questions about a species he clearly respected very seriously. He told me he did not believe humans had wanted this outcome, based on everything we had witnessed of their genuine efforts toward peaceful resolution throughout the crisis. but he said humans were pragmatic enough to recognize when conflict became unavoidable, and disciplined enough to prepare thoroughly for that possibility while still pursuing every reasonable alternative first. He said this combination of hope for peace, alongside preparation for its failure, was perhaps the most important lesson other species could learn from observing humanity's approach to conflict. As our observation team prepared to accompany the human fleet toward the border region where the coming confrontation would unfold, I found myself reflecting on everything I had learned since that first day at Kestrel Station. The species I had once dismissed as fortunate, but ultimately limited, had revealed itself to be something far more complex, patient enough to absorb repeated provocation while quietly preparing a response, compassionate enough to extend genuine care to the vulnerable and even to their eventual enemies, yet resolved enough to act decisively once patience had reached its natural limit. I thought about Grace Bennett's words from months earlier about protecting people because it was right, and remembering when someone hurt those they protected. I thought about Commander Whitfield's controlled anger upon learning that Korath forces had deliberately targeted civilians. I thought about the careful, methodical preparation that Oliver Pratt and Margaret Whitmore had described, preparation built on patience rather than fear. The Korath Alliance had spent generations believing that compassion and strength were opposing forces, that any species capable of genuine kindness must necessarily be weak in conflict. They were about to learn, in the most direct way possible, exactly how wrong that assumption truly was, and the entire galaxy would watch as that lesson unfolded across the stars near New Harmony. Doran and I were given a position aboard a Council observation vessel stationed at a safe distance from the New Harmony system, along with representatives from several other species curious to witness how the conflict would unfold. I remember the tension in that observation deck, dozens of delegates from different worlds crowded around sensor displays, murmuring theories about how the confrontation might proceed. Human Fleet Command had shared a general outline of their intentions with Council observers, as required by the transparency agreements governing military action within shared territory. Their stated goal was straightforward: to liberate New Harmony from Korath occupation, secure the safety of remaining civilians, and dismantle the military capability that had made the attack possible in the first place. What surprised many observers, myself included, was how quickly the operation began after the declaration. Within hours of the formal notice, human task groups that had been positioned across the border region began converging on the New Harmony system from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordination that should have been impossible given the vast distances involved. I watched the sensor displays as dozens of human vessels appeared seemingly out of nowhere along the edges of Korath-occupied space, moving with a precision that left several military analysts among the observers visibly stunned. A delegate from a heavily militarized species beside me muttered that such coordinated movement across such distances should have required months of preparation, not the weeks that had passed since the attack. The first phase of the operation targeted Korath communication relays throughout the region, cutting off the occupying forces at New Harmony from immediate contact with Korath High Command. This happened so quickly and quietly that Korath forces on the ground did not realize their communications had been severed until they attempted to request reinforcements and received no response. Doran explained to me, based on information shared by Margaret Whitmore before we departed, that this isolation was deliberate and central to human strategy. By cutting off Korath forces from Central Command, human forces prevented any possibility of coordinated retaliation or reinforcement, allowing them to address the immediate threat at New Harmony without risking the conflict spreading to other unprepared regions. The second phase involved a careful, methodical approach to the New Harmony system itself. Rather than a direct frontal assault that might endanger remaining civilians still trapped on the planet's surface, human forces deployed specialized teams to identify and neutralize the specific Korath command positions responsible for maintaining control over the occupied territory. I watched footage shared by Human Fleet Command showing these operations unfold with remarkable precision, Small, fast-moving vessels approached Korath positions from unexpected angles, using their intimate knowledge of Korath sensor limitations, gathered during those months of careful study, to approach undetected until the last possible moment. A Council military analyst reviewing the footage alongside us noted with clear astonishment that human forces seemed to know exactly where Korath defenses were weakest, striking precisely those points with minimal wasted effort. Doran reminded me quietly that this was exactly what Margaret Whitmore had described, months of patient study now paying dividends in a conflict that could have easily become far more costly without such careful preparation. Throughout the operation, human commanders maintained constant communication with Council observers, providing updates on civilian safety and casualty figures on both sides. I noted with interest that human forces went to considerable lengths to offer Korath soldiers opportunities to surrender before engaging directly, broadcasting clear warnings and safe passage instructions to any who chose to lay down their weapons. Many Korath soldiers, confused by communication blackouts and uncertain of their situation, accepted these surrender terms rather than continuing to fight for a cause they no longer fully understood. Those who chose to continue resisting found themselves facing forces that responded with swift, decisive action, but always constrained by clear rules of engagement, designed to minimize unnecessary harm even to hostile combatants. I remember Doran pointing out something significant during this phase of the operation. He noted that human forces consistently prioritized capturing rather than simply defeating Korath commanders whenever possible, a choice that seemed to slow their operational pace, but that he believed served a larger purpose beyond the immediate military objective. Within 3 days, human forces had secured full control of the New Harmony system, liberating the remaining civilian population and establishing full control over the orbital space surrounding the planet. Korath ground forces that had not surrendered found themselves cut off, surrounded, and ultimately compelled to accept terms of surrender presented by human commanders on the ground. The 4th day brought what many observers, including myself, considered the most significant development of the entire operation. Human Fleet Command announced they had identified and located the specific Korath command vessel responsible for authorizing and coordinating the attack on New Harmony, a vessel that had remained safely behind the front lines throughout the entire assault, directing operations from a position its commanders believed to be secure. Rather than launching a direct attack against this vessel, human forces instead surrounded it completely, cutting off any possibility of escape or reinforcement, and opened a direct communication channel to its commanding officer, a senior Korath official named Dravith, who had orchestrated the entire New Harmony campaign. I was present in the observation area when this communication was shared with Council delegates in real time. Dravith's voice, when it finally responded to the human hail, carried none of the confidence I had heard from Threxil months earlier at Kestrel Station. He demanded to know how human forces had located his position and achieved such rapid, coordinated success against what he had believed to be a secure and well-defended occupation. The human commander leading the operation, a woman named Charlotte Ainsley, answered him directly and without hesitation. She explained plainly that human forces had spent considerable time studying Korath tactics and command structures, precisely because they had hoped to avoid exactly this kind of conflict, preferring diplomatic resolution whenever possible, but had prepared thoroughly in case such preparation became necessary. She informed Dravith that his forces throughout the New Harmony system had already surrendered or been neutralized, that his command vessel was now completely surrounded, with no possibility of escape, and that she was offering him a choice regarding how this confrontation would ultimately conclude. Dravith, still defiant despite his obviously desperate position, demanded to know what choice she believed she could offer him. Charlotte Ainsley's response was calm, measured, and carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire observation deck as her words were translated for the assembled delegates. She told him that human forces had no interest in destroying the Korath Alliance or its people. She said humanity understood that most Korath citizens had no knowledge of or involvement in the decision to attack civilian populations, and that punishing an entire species for the actions of its leadership would violate the very principles humanity sought to protect throughout this conflict. She offered Dravith a formal surrender, one that would result in his transfer to council custody for trial regarding the attack on New Harmony, alongside a broader agreement requiring Korath Alliance leadership to accept binding oversight from the Galactic Council regarding future military actions, along with substantial reparations to rebuild New Harmony and support the families of those lost during the initial attack. She made clear that refusal of this offer would result in immediate and complete neutralization of his command vessel and the elimination of his ability to continue directing Korath military operations from any position, a consequence she stated without anger or threat, simply as plain fact. Dravith remained silent for a long moment before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a bitterness that seemed directed as much at his own leadership's misjudgment as at the humans who had defeated him so thoroughly. He asked Charlotte Ainsley why humans had waited so long to respond with such decisive force, when clearly they had possessed the capability all along. Her answer, delivered without hesitation, struck me as the clearest explanation I had yet heard of the principle underlying humanity's entire approach to this conflict. She told him that humans preferred peace whenever peace remained genuinely possible, and that the capability to respond decisively existed specifically so it would rarely need to be used, serving as a deterrent rather than a tool for aggression. She said the tragedy of New Harmony occurred because Korath leadership had mistaken that preference for peace as an absence of capability, a mistake she hoped his surrender would help prevent other species from repeating in the future. Dravith ultimately accepted the surrender terms, recognizing that continued resistance would accomplish nothing beyond needless loss of life among forces still loyal to him. His command vessel powered down its weapons systems and allowed human boarding parties to take control, completing the liberation of New Harmony without further significant conflict. I remember the observation deck falling completely silent as this final surrender was confirmed, dozens of delegates from across the galaxy processing what they had just witnessed. A species they had considered technologically limited and militarily cautious had just dismantled a feared raiding empire's occupation force within 4 days, achieving nearly complete victory while minimizing casualties on both sides and offering genuine mercy to an enemy who had shown none to human civilians. Doran turned to me as the observation session concluded, and I saw in his expression something between relief and profound realization. He told me that what we had just witnessed would likely become one of the most studied military campaigns in galactic history, not for its scale or destruction, but for the remarkable balance it demonstrated between decisive capability and genuine restraint. I asked him what he believed the Korath Alliance leadership, and indeed every other species watching this conflict unfold, would take away from these events. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. He said he believed every species in the galaxy had just received the clearest possible demonstration of a principle that experienced diplomats had quietly understood for some time, that humans were capable of extraordinary compassion precisely because they possessed equally extraordinary capability, and that mistaking the former for weakness would always, eventually, prove to be a serious miscalculation. As our observation vessel prepared to return to Council territory, carrying detailed reports of everything we had witnessed, I found myself already anticipating the discussions that would follow at the Galactic Council, discussions that would ultimately shape how every species approached their relationship with humanity going forward, for generations to come. The formal council session convened 3 weeks after the liberation of New Harmony, and I had never seen the Great Chamber so completely full. Delegates from every member species crowded the assembly, along with observers from smaller, unaffiliated worlds hoping to join the council in coming years, all eager to hear the official accounting of what had transpired. Dravith appeared before the tribunal via secure transmission from council custody, offering a formal confession regarding his role in authorizing the attack on New Harmony. His testimony confirmed everything human intelligence had suspected, that Korath Alliance leadership had deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, believing humanity would either fail to respond effectively or would hesitate so long that any response would arrive too late to matter. Charlotte Ainsley testified next, providing a detailed account of the military operation from initial planning through final surrender. I watched the chamber's reaction carefully as she described the coordination between scattered task groups, the careful targeting of communication infrastructure, and the deliberate choice to offer surrender terms even to enemy combatants who had shown no such mercy to human civilians. A delegate from a heavily militarized species, one who had previously dismissed human capabilities as limited, asked Charlotte Ainsley directly why human forces had extended surrender opportunities to Korath soldiers who had participated in an unprovoked attack against civilians. Her answer, delivered without hesitation, seemed to resonate throughout the entire chamber. She explained that human military doctrine distinguished carefully between those who authorized aggression and those who simply followed orders within a rigid command structure that offered little room for independent judgment. She said that punishing common soldiers for decisions made by leadership they had little power to question would accomplish nothing beyond perpetuating cycles of resentment and future conflict. She said true justice required holding the actual decision-makers accountable, while offering those who followed orders a genuine path toward peaceful resolution. The delegate pressed further, asking whether this approach did not risk appearing weak to other potential aggressors, who might interpret such mercy as an invitation for future provocation. Charlotte Ainsley's response drew quiet murmurs of agreement from several delegations around the chamber. She said that mercy extended after decisive victory could never reasonably be mistaken for weakness, since it was offered from a position of complete strength rather than desperate necessity. She said the true lesson of New Harmony was not that humans were merciful because they were weak, but that they could afford to be merciful precisely because they were not. Doran was called to testify regarding his observations throughout the entire crisis, from the initial incident at Kestrel Station through the final surrender at New Harmony. He spoke thoughtfully, describing the pattern he had recognized early on: humanity's consistent preference for measured, careful responses that escalated only in direct proportion to the severity and repetition of provocation they faced. I was called to testify as well, offering my own observations as a junior officer who had initially misunderstood much of what I witnessed, only gradually coming to appreciate the deeper principles guiding human behavior throughout the crisis. I shared Grace Bennett's words from our first conversation about protecting people because it was right, and remembering when someone hurt those they protected. I watched several delegates note these words down carefully, recognizing them as a concise summary of everything the tribunal had spent days examining in detail. The council ultimately issued a formal ruling condemning the Korath Alliance leadership responsible for the attack, imposing binding oversight requirements and substantial reparations, while explicitly commending human forces for their conduct throughout the liberation of New Harmony. The ruling specifically praised the balance human commanders had struck between decisive military action and genuine restraint toward both civilians and surrendering combatants. But the most significant outcome of that council session, at least from my perspective, was not the formal ruling itself, but a quieter conversation that took place afterward among senior diplomats from across the galaxy, a conversation Doran invited me to observe as part of my ongoing education regarding interspecies relations. Representatives from a dozen different species gathered informally to discuss what they had learned from the entire crisis, and how it might reshape their own approach to relations with humanity going forward. I listened as delegate after delegate acknowledged that their previous assumptions about human capability and temperament had been fundamentally mistaken, built on humanity's youth as a spacefaring species and their consistent preference for diplomatic solutions over displays of military strength. An elder diplomat from a long-established species, one who had served on the council for longer than most delegates present had been alive, offered what I came to understand as the clearest summary of the lesson every species present had learned. He said that humans possessed an unusual combination of traits that most species assumed to be mutually exclusive: deep compassion for the vulnerable alongside remarkable capability for decisive action when that compassion was deliberately exploited or betrayed. He explained that this combination made humans uniquely reliable allies, since their protection of those weaker than themselves stemmed from genuine principle rather than calculated self-interest, meaning it remained consistent regardless of what advantage might be gained by abandoning it. But he cautioned that this same combination made humans profoundly dangerous adversaries for any species foolish enough to test the limits of that principle, since their restraint, once exhausted, gave way to a level of decisive capability that few species in the galaxy could genuinely match. I asked him directly, since Doran had encouraged me to participate actively in these discussions rather than simply observing, how newer species joining the Council might best avoid the mistakes the Korath Alliance had made. His answer became something I would repeat countless times throughout my own career as a diplomat in the years that followed. He said the simplest guidance he could offer was this: treat humanity's kindness as a genuine gift rather than an exploitable weakness, and their patience as a limited resource rather than an endless supply. He said species that approached humanity with honesty and respect would find no more reliable or generous ally anywhere in the galaxy, while species that mistook their restraint for fear would eventually discover, often too late, exactly how mistaken that assumption truly was. In the months following the New Harmony Tribunal, I watched relations between humanity and the broader Council shift in subtle but meaningful ways. Species that had previously dismissed human delegates with quiet condescension now approached them with genuine respect, seeking their input on matters of diplomacy and conflict resolution with a seriousness that had been notably absent before the crisis. Grace Bennett, whom I had first observed disabling 3 warships without a single casualty months earlier, was invited to address the full council regarding lessons learned from the crisis. I attended that address, curious to hear how she would summarize everything that had transpired since our first encounter at Kestrel Station. She spoke without notes, her manner as calm and measured as it had been during that very first confrontation with Threxil. She told the assembled delegates that humanity had not sought this conflict and took no satisfaction from the loss of life it had ultimately required, on either side of the confrontation. She said humanity's deepest hope remained a galaxy where such conflicts became increasingly rare, as species learned to resolve their differences through genuine cooperation rather than aggression. But she also said, with quiet conviction that seemed to settle over the entire chamber, that humanity would never abandon its commitment to protecting those unable to protect themselves, regardless of the cost such protection might eventually require. She said this commitment was not a policy that could be negotiated away or a strategy adopted for convenience, but a principle woven into the very foundation of human civilization across its long and often difficult history. She closed her address with words that Doran later told me were quietly adopted as an unofficial guiding principle among council diplomats when advising new species preparing to establish relations with humanity for the first time. She said that any species approaching humanity in good faith would find patience, generosity, and genuine partnership offered freely and without condition. But she said any species that mistook that generosity for weakness or believed human compassion could be exploited without consequence would eventually learn exactly why every experienced diplomat in the galaxy offered the same careful warning to those just beginning to understand humanity's true nature. Years later, long after I had grown from that nervous junior officer who first watched Grace Bennett calmly disable 3 warships at Kestrel Station, I found myself in the position Doran had once occupied, mentoring a new generation of young diplomats preparing to encounter humanity for the first time. I told them the same story I have told you now, beginning with that first incident, through the tribunal at Farron's Reach, the difficult days of studying human history and preparation, the liberation of New Harmony, and finally the quiet wisdom shared by that elder diplomat whose words I had carried with me throughout my entire career. I always closed my telling of this story the same way Doran once closed his own lessons to me, with the simplest and most important guidance I could offer to any species just beginning their relationship with humanity. Approach them with honesty, and you will find no ally more steadfast or generous anywhere among the stars. But should you ever mistake their patience for weakness, or their compassion for an opportunity to exploit, you will learn, just as the Korath Alliance once learned, exactly why the Galactic Council carries forward this same quiet warning to every new species that joins our shared community among the stars. Never cross humans, not because they seek conflict, but because when kindness fails to reach those who would do harm, what remains is a resolve unlike anything else this galaxy has ever known.